Hello, happy new solar year, and welcome back to Ramblings of Vanaheim. AG here to walk you through another rabbit trail of our journey together. Today's episode will be a little shorter than the rest, but still jam-packed with information. Before I continue the next section of the genealogical chart for Norse mythology, I thought I would go over a list of basic source material I utilize for my thoughts, ideas, and even my UPG. The quantity and quality of existing text for this genre is small compared to larger areas such as Greco-Roman and Vedic. However, what exists far exceeds the material available for such areas as Celtic, Welsh, Gaulish, and even Finno-Baltic sources. Those of us who study this mythology are quite fortunate when you think about it in this context. We also have archaeological evidence, such as runestones, birch bark letters, early Viking graffiti, bracteates, carved artwork, burial sites, eyewitness accounts in other cultures, etc. These taken as a whole, rather than in individual pieces, give us a wealth of information to pull from and interpret. And it never gets old. I see what I did there. The Nordic peoples had so many layers to their beliefs and culture that one could spend a lifetime researching and never even get truly halfway finished. The term expert is not a positive one, I think. Expert lends itself to the idea that one knows all there is to know and there is nothing else. Why do that to yourself? I, for one, choose not to use a word that would create an environment of stagnation. I want to keep finding new things, interpreting existing materials with different shades and outlooks, and grow my multifaceted understanding for the rest of my life. That, to me, is the coolest thing one could ever do. When using source material, there is a simple way to classify them: primary, secondary, tertiary, and what I refer to as other. Think concentric circles of concentration. Let's keep this easy for everyone. A primary source is the first-hand account at the very center of the diagram. In Norse mythology, we do not have any primary sources extant for the actual belief system that the people known as Vikings held. And the term Vikings is actually a little bit of a misnomer as well, simply because a Viking is a verb. We've just taken a verb and turned it into a noun. Not every person that lived in the Scandinavian and Nordic regions was a Viking, but they were Nordic. They were an oral tradition society during the pagan times. And while depictions on runestones and carvings may appear, these are still not primary sources. We do not have the original version. We have a version. Secondary sources would be the next circle out and occur when someone recounts the events of a primary source, sometimes verbatim if the source is right in front of them, and other times in their own words when they are simply remembering what another person said and did. The tone could change depending on word choice and at times even the meaning when the author recounting the tale misunderstands or mistranslates the original text. Tertiary sources go out even farther. A tertiary source could be a retelling of a retelling of a retelling. The farther out you go, the more likely that the original material is going to be altered in some way. The Christian Bible is a perfect example of a tertiary text. It starts in Old Hebrew, then someone tried to make that very concept-oriented language translate into Old Greek verbatim. By the way, it doesn't translate word for word. That mistranslation then morphs into various forms of Latin. And again, Old Greek, which is already the mistranslation, doesn't translate verbatim, word for word, into Latin. Over the course of a couple centuries, several councils, such as Nicaea, actually threw out biblical text that didn't align with their more stringent patriarchal leanings of that time. They then rewrote the text to suit their new ideologies. When you move across Europe, Asia, and Africa, scribes copying the text with various degrees of accuracy cause words and tones to be written inaccurately. Most of the medieval manuscripts are going to be pretty heavily abbreviated, and if the scribe wasn't familiar with a particular marking to denote an abbreviation, he might get it wrong, thus completely changing the tone of the sentence. Then we have medieval scholars trying to translate these Latin texts into whatever vernacular they speak. Vernacular being the word that refers to their native language, such as German, French, English, Italian, etc. Latin is a case language. French, Spanish, even English are more Romance languages. They don't follow the same rules and guidelines for breaking down the actual language into sections. And sometimes this would work, but there are concepts and words that have to find the closest translation rather than a word for word, and as you can guess, this causes even more errors. Finally, we get to good old King James I of England, you know, the dude that really hates all the witches. And he rewrote the Bible because he wanted to fix what he considered to be inconsistencies. So this was at that time, modern day English king who rewrote the Bible. The majority of available English Bibles today have some connection to or basis in the King James Version. He changed the text all over the place. So the Bible that people tend to thump and use to justify their beliefs and bigotry, that's not the original Word of God. It's a mistranslation of a mistranslation of a mistranslation, and so on, that can only be considered a tertiary source at best. Tertiary sources can be problematic for the exact reasons the Bible isn't a good resource from a scholastic standpoint. This does not mean that the sources cannot be fulfilling in a spiritual sense. A person can still find great peace, meaning, and enjoyment from the material as they feel it pertains to their situation. It just should not be used to justify prejudice and hate. What are the other sources I refer to? Well, these are often more modern things like fiction books, artwork, graphic novels, comics, movies, TV series, where the writers and artists are creating a world, a concept, and characters that, while they may not be exact to any primary sources, they may trigger a response in the viewer or listener or reader that we like to call an aha moment. It unlocks something that feels so fundamentally right, it just has to be the truth. There is no evidence to support it, but you just know, and I'm using air quotes at this point. You know, that intuition. You see this one little sentence in a book that otherwise is probably just garbage, and that one little nugget, it sends you on this entire enlightened path that you had no idea was out there. You just needed that little insight. And that to me is when the powers that be come in and they utilize the materials in front of you to help and guide you, to educate you, to show you the way. So yes, modern materials can become sources. It's one side of UPG. And it's okay to use these types of materials as long as you recognize and credit them to be exactly what they are: unverified personal gnosis. Don't pass these on as factual. This is when you find yourself in trouble, especially in academia. Well, let's review the sources that I will invariably utilize over the course of my podcast, leaving room to incorporate others as I find them. Now, the first source is the Prose Edda. You've most likely heard of the Prose Edda. And this was written by Snorri Sturluson, an Icelander, who wanted to not only preserve the style of writing of ancient, well, maybe not ancient, but early Icelandic poets, but he was also writing for the King of Norway and wanted to impress him with the capabilities of Icelanders. Now, sometimes this book is referred to as Snorri's Edda, or the Younger Edda, and that's not exactly accurate. I'll explain it in just a little bit. There are a couple of translations into English from scholars such as Anthony Fawkes, Jesse Byock, Arthur Gilchrist Brodeur, and Rasmus B. Anderson. I own the Fawkes and Anderson versions, which is what I generally use in the course of my research. Now, there may be other translators of the material, but these are the ones that are fairly big names that people are going to be able to find. They're also recognized by academia. The second source I utilize is the Poetic Edda, and this is sometimes referred to as the Elder Edda or Saemon's Edda. Now, here's where I'm going to explain my little comment above about it being a slight mistake. The Poetic Edda is actually written, the manuscript that holds the majority of the poems that are included in the Poetic Edda, such as Völuspá. That manuscript was actually written after Snorri's version. Snorri's version, however, in the Prose Edda, he references a bunch of the poetry that exists in the Poetic Edda. So technically, his manuscript might be older, but the material that he's writing, his actual text, is younger, because at some point there must have been an earlier manuscript. That earlier manuscript would have been copied into the existing Poetic Edda manuscript today. And that's why it's sort of not accurate to refer to one as the younger or the older Edda when you're reviewing the actual manuscripts. The texts themselves, yes, the poems are older than the Prose Edda, but the manuscript that they're written on is not. So just enjoy that fun little fact from manuscript studies. There are some translators, actually quite a few translators, of the Poetic Edda. These include Carolyn Larrington, Jackson Crawford, Andy Orchard, Ursula Dronke, Lee Hollander, Benjamin Thorpe, and Kevin Crossley Holland. There are more, but these are the big names that are associated with translations. Dr. Larrington and Dr. Crawford actually have 2 editions of their translation out, with Dr. Crawford's recently coming out, and I highly recommend it. I'm really enjoying looking through his material. I like to combine Dr. Larrington and Dr. Crawford and then look and see what Mr. Orchard has in his. I have Kevin Crossley Holland, and I think somewhere I may have Hollander's version of the Poetic Edda in a box somewhere, but I do not have Thorpe or Dronke. I would love to have Dronke's volumes, but even now they are tremendously expensive, and thus far I can't afford them. So until I hit the lottery or gain a wealthy benefactor, I use the more modern, less expensive translations, as they help me to explain the ideas to others in a more cohesive, relatable way. There are some people who, while they enjoy Ursula Dronke's, I think she's up to 3 volumes of the Poetic Edda, and Miss Dronke has passed away, she doesn't really review all of the poetic poems. She only hits some of them, so it's not a full translation of the text. She gives so many annotations and notes, however, that it's quite extensive in these volumes. She just doesn't do the entire Poetic Edda. She ran out of time, I suppose. I still would like to own it. A third source would be the Heimskringla, written by Snorri Sturluson as well. Now, this is the history of the kings of Norway, and in volume 1 of the Viking Society for Northern Research translations, in volume 1, he hits oh so briefly, in my opinion, on the mythology and gives a little bit more detail that he didn't share in the Prose Edda. So we get just enough more to add some layers, add a few little details, but sadly, not any more of the stories. And in the translations of the Heimskringla, we have Rasmus B. Anderson, Lee Hollander, as I already mentioned, the Viking Society for Northern Research. It's a 3-volume set, and the senior editor, I believe, is Dr. Allison Finley. Another translation would be from Samuel Lang, William Morris. There's an Erling Monson and A.H. Smith. And I have the volume 1 from the VSNR. And then I have probably one of the other older translations, but I don't have every single translator. I would love to, but again, cost. A fourth source is going to be Saxo Grammaticus, the History of the Danes, volume 1 through 9. Now, this is the primary one that actually has stories that are linked to Norse mythology. Saxo Grammaticus is Danish, and he's writing centuries after. Now, this is sometimes referred to as the Gesto or Gesto Danorum. Translators of this Danish text have been Hilda Ellis Davidson, Oliver Elton, Peter Fisher, and Karsten Friis Jensen. I may have butchered some names in the recounting of all these translators. Hopefully, they are not turning over in their graves or feeling some horrible way if they're still alive. Saxo's version is a problematic text, and I'm really not a fan of using it as a primary source. I have referenced a few points in my time, and so I should make sure that I'm listing it here. There are a few, very few stories that don't exist in the prose or the Poetic Edda or in Heimskringla, and so that gives us something, but we have to heavily filter Saxo. In my personal opinion, he's an ass, and I don't like his writing. But getting back to the point of this, a few earlier sources are going to be Tacitus's Germania, Sagas of the Icelanders, Ecclesiastical History by Bede, maybe the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and some random poems here and there as I find them. Other more modern texts may be from Victor Rydberg's Teutonic Mythology, which I may refer to as Investigations into Germanic Mythology, Old Norse Mythology by John Lindau, Dictionary of Northern Mythology by Rudolf Simek, The Road to Hell, a study of the conception of the dead by Hilda Ellis Davidson, The Norse Myths, a guide to the gods and heroes by Carolyn Larrington, and, a ton of articles freely available on academia.edu. Now, admittedly, there may be references to texts where the author themselves is problematic due to political and racial biases. And I want to be honest about that. In those instances, I will try to warn the listener ahead of time and discuss only the material relevant to the subject as objectively as I am able. The authors may suck as human beings, and the material may make you cringe a little, but it is important to know it within the context to better discern what works and what doesn't, what was inspired by this material and what avoided this material. I will try to be as sensitive as I can when those texts come up and warn the listener of their shady content or jerk of an author. If I miss any and end up quoting them in my podcasts, please let me know in a respectful way. My goal is not to spread hate speech or problematic ideas that root themselves in nasty white supremacy and bigotry, but rather to broaden the horizons and share my love for a subject that is filled with so much wonder and nuance. Overall, I will utilize these sources from podcast to podcast. I may not always give a complete bibliography, as some of the episode descriptions have limited characters in the boxes. And the ones that have the expanded boxes, well, they require a subscription I can't afford right now. Just know that these are my texts of reference. And whenever I hit a section that involves that other category, I will try to give a UPG warning before I continue with the thought going forward. I am always looking for ways to improve and resources to utilize. If you have any suggestions, please feel free to add them in the comment section. As always, I will review any comments left to ensure that anyone and everyone is playing nicely and nothing disrespectful is left for others to endure. Until we meet again, my lovely little heathens and heathen friendlies, Happy New Year. Remember your connection to the divine, and with all of this insane chaos going on in the world, don't forget to find your sacred breath.